Hi everyone, welcome to our conversation on the common elements of privilege and oppression. As you'll see by the slideshow and the audio presentation, we're going to spend some time this week talking about the definition of privilege, the definition of oppression, and the common elements of each. We're also going to talk about what privilege and oppression do for those who experience them and the different types of privilege and oppression. Okay, so that said, we're going to move on, to talk briefly about being colorblind. A lot of you all may have said that you're colorblind or may have heard others say that they're colorblind. But the reality is, in our literature today, and the literature is very clear about this, is that being colorblind is not a good thing. As you can see by the cartoon here, what we mean when we actually say that I don't see race or gender or sexual orientation is that we're denying our place of privilege, and we're going to deny those who are suffering as a function of not having that form of privilege. Okay. In doing so, the allegation is that we effectively erase people's personal privilege. We erase their personal history. When we say that we don't see race, what we're saying is that we don't see the impact of race and the way that race adversely often affects people's lives. One of the important things in working to address issues of privilege and oppression is that we need to own our stuff. And let me tell you, this is not easy. At 51, I feel like I've spent the bulk of my adult years working on this. But it's important that, as you see here, we acknowledge that differences exist and that people do in fact experience privilege and oppression because of the way that we respond to differences. The consequence is that we need to own how we experience privilege, how we benefit from it, and how others suffer from it. The ultimate question becomes, got privilege? The ultimate answer is, yes, most of us do. And we're going to spend some time talking about that. One of the things that you really need to be aware of is that most of us are inclined and really want to push back against the concept that we do have privilege. As you'll see in the later slides, we have a natural tendency to resist this. One of the things that the articles talk about is that many of us don't feel privileged, and that privilege affords us the luxuriousness of being oblivious to our own privilege. Again, as we'll talk about later in this presentation, one of the things that it's often easier to do is to focus on our oppressed characteristics rather than our privileged characteristics. Okay, so what is privilege? You can see the definition here. Privilege is defined as the power and advantages that benefit a group derived from the oppression and exploitation of other groups. It is also unearned access to resources readily available to some people as a function of their group membership. Okay? These are two really important components of privilege, and the probability of these two things being on the test is very high. Another component of privilege is it's not something most of us feel. It's not a feeling, okay? But it is a function of these unearned advantages due to membership in certain groups. So given this, and again, this is really important, we are privileged despite not feeling privileged. I hear this a lot from people, particularly from students. They'll ask me, well, how can I be privileged if I don't feel privileged? Okay. Well, if we think about other feelings, someone may say, well, I don't feel angry, but clearly their behavior suggests that they are angry. Okay. I don't feel like I'm a part of the middle class, but when you look at your income, for example, your income often suggests that you are a part of the middle class. Okay. So privilege is not a feeling, but as we see here, it is a function of getting things that we don't necessarily earn because of membership in particular groups. So the bottom line is that most people have some form of privilege. We need to identify it and own it. And for your privilege paper, your reaction paper for this class, you are actually asked to identify some of the types of privilege that you experience. I want you to start thinking about it now. What types of privilege do you have? What types of privilege do you have that are based on race, sex, socioeconomic class, religion, gender identity and expression, your ability or health status, or your immigration status? Again, it's really important that you start to give thought to these. As we begin our brief discussion on oppression, we're going to start first with the definition. I want you to note the different components of it. First off, you'll see that depression is a systemic social phenomenon. What this means is that it's system-wide. Oppression is not confined to a single individual, but it is influenced by and perpetuated by systems. Another component of oppression is that it's based on both perceived and real differences among social groups. Okay? The fact that oppression occurs without actually having real differences, but often occurs based on perceived differences, is very important to the definition. What it comes down to is that oppression occurs as a function of perception and often not reality. Third component of oppression is that it involves ideological domination and institutional control. An example of institutional control is with our voter ID laws. We have recently started requiring more and more identification that for some is harder to get as a way to limit those who vote. Another example of institutional control is the fact that we kept gays and lesbians from marrying same-sex partners for so long. Okay? In doing so, we denied gays and lesbians who wanted to marry their same-sex partners, we denied them over 1,000 federally appointed benefits that were associated with federal marriage. Okay? Fourth component to oppression is the promulgation of the privileged group's ideology, logic system, and culture to the oppressed group. What this means is that the privileged group basically transmits their beliefs and their culture to the oppressed groups. That's one of the functions of oppression. Okay? The net result is that privileged groups exploit one social group for their benefit. Okay? So keep the different components of this definition in mind as we go along throughout this presentation. Okay. It's important to note the relationship between privilege and oppression. Okay. Bottom line is we can't have oppression without privilege. Many of you all have probably heard for years about oppression, but never really thought much about privilege. We don't have oppressed groups unless we have privileged groups. If we have an oppressed group, we need to be looking for the privileged group. Okay? Anytime we have the combination of prejudice and social power by the privileged groups, we have oppression. And these are the common elements of both privilege and oppression. We're going to spend some more time talking about other common elements. Okay, common elements of oppression. You see some of them, we're going to spend some time highlighting them. Okay. One of the common elements is that people with privilege get to define the norm. Okay? People who are heterosexually married got to define the norm for gays and lesbians who wanted to get married. Many years ago, it was uncommon to actually do research on women. We would actually do medical research on men and basically say, this is the standard, all women are different, And because they're different, they are bad. Therefore, men's standard is good. And so we would say basically what men did, some of their physical components was actually better. And this is what we call a standard of righteousness, or rightness, and often righteousness, whereby all others were judged in relation to it. Okay. Another common element of oppression is institutional power. Okay. Institutions of society provide the advantaged group with the ability to exert power and control over those of the targeted group. Again, if we use same-sex marriage as an example, most of the people elected to office were heterosexuals, okay? And they limited the institution of marriage to other heterosexuals, okay? The result was that they kept gays and lesbians oppressed in this regard. Okay. Economic power refers to control over access to resources, mobility, and employment options. Okay? Think about this. Who passes legislation? How do you get elected to office? Well, in today's society in the U.S. and in most other countries, it takes a lot of money to get elected. And then what happens is that you typically pass legislation that benefits others with lots of money. Okay? There is research that shows that the percent of our federal expenses that go to supporting people via programs such as temporary assistance to needy families is a very small percent of the federal government's budget. Okay? And yet, people who do not need those resources, who have no need to apply for temporary assistance to needy families, actually are the ones that are elected to and vote on whether or not that should be supported at the state and federal level. Okay? So economic power is another common element of oppression. Okay? The myth of scarcity is actually something I really enjoy talking about. And basically, it's used to pit people against each other. And in doing so, we foster the belief that resources are limited and blaming members of the targeted group for using too much of the limited resources available. Okay? This was kind of funny in our conversations and in the ongoing debate about same-sex marriage. And even though it may not seem like the myth of scarcity, basically, one of the arguments that was made was that same-sex marriage was a threat to heterosexual marriage, and that if we allowed gays and lesbians to marry their same-sex partners, it was going to severely limit and threaten heterosexual marriage in that particular institution. Okay. The myth of scarcity is frequently used in other areas. It's basically saying, if I give you some, there won't be enough for me, and I want to keep what I've got, and because there's only a finite amount of whatever it is that you want that I have, I won't let you have it. Okay? One of the suggestions that's made in the oppression literature, it's not talked about in this slide in any detail, is that we don't really have, for example, famines throughout the world. What we have is control and access to food. Control and access to food is actually used in a lot of communist countries to keep people oppressed. And they do so by creating this illusion that there is not enough food to go around and to be shared. Okay. Another common element of oppression is violence. And violence is used to keep people in line. We see this particularly with violence against women and violence against people of color. If you look at some of the concerns about the police shootings of black men, this is one way in which many have argued that violence is used as an element or a weapon, if you will, of oppression. Okay. The threat of violence is also a common element of oppression. The absence of prosecution of violence, the absence of prosecution, effective prosecution of people who are alleged to have committed sexual assaults, is something that we all need to be considering and taking a look at when we look at common elements of oppression. Okay. The result is that it leads targeted members to live with a constant threat that violence against them can be carried out by an advantaged group, and done so with relative impunity, with few consequences. Okay? And if you look at, again, some of the cases in the media that have gotten a lot of press, there's a lot of basically white heterosexual men who are accused of sexually assaulting women, and the consequences for these attacks, even when they have been found or have pled guilty, have been relatively limited. Okay? So that's one of the ways in which the threat of violence is often used as a way of oppressing members of oppressed groups. Okay, lack of prior claim is another element of oppression, another common element of oppression. This means basically if you weren't there when it was first created, such as the Constitution, you don't have any right to be included. Okay? What this means, or a good example of this rather, is that people of color and women were not among those who wrote the Constitution. Therefore, it took years to get them included when it came to protecting our rights. Okay? So if you weren't there when something was founded, you were judged in relation to those who were actually part of the creation of something, whether it's the Constitution or a particular institution. Okay? Another common element of oppression is that people who are oppressed feel invisible. They feel like they're not seen. Okay? Great example of this is that a lot of history books do not share and do not discuss the accomplishments of people of color or of women in the same way that they do men and white people. Okay? It ultimately leads us to believe that these people do not exist and do not matter. What some in the diversity academic literature refer to this is basically they say that our history texts in particular, have been whitewashed. Okay, moving on. Another common element of oppression is distortion. False information is presented about the oppressed group. All people, for example, who receive welfare are lazy. All people who receive welfare are on drugs. So we require drug testing. And then we require drug testing, and we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars for only a couple of positive tests. Okay, this is another example of a common element of oppression. Okay, one of the things that may be more familiar to you is that we stereotype members of oppressed groups. And stereotyping can be both good stereotypes and bad stereotypes. Certain racial groups are perceived to have certain positive characteristics. For example, historically, African American men were considered to be more sexually virile. Okay? This, in many ways, may seem to be a good stereotype, but the reality is that all stereotypes are problematic. Okay? Another common element of oppression is blaming the victim, and this is one you've probably heard of before. Okay? Basically, we blame victims for what happens to them. If she hadn't been dressed that way, she wouldn't have been assaulted. If he hadn't, been driving in that white neighborhood, that the black kid wouldn't have been shot by the police. So blaming the victim is a very common tool and very common element of oppression. Finally, 3 more common elements of oppression. Basically, we isolate members of oppressed groups. There's a relationship quite often between race and socioeconomic class. We call this the eth-class relationship. And what we often see is that poor people of color live in particular parts of towns or cities so that they are isolated from other people. Okay? These areas of town also are frequently lacking in resources, particularly grocery stores and access to banks and fresh food. Okay? Another common element is assimilation. It occurs when members of targeted groups drop their culture and differences and seek to assume the culture and characteristics of the advantaged group. I've heard from a lot of people that when this happens, people of the oppressed group are subject to criticism by both groups. And I could give you examples, but a lot of those examples I've heard are less than positive in their terminology. But I want you to think about if you know of when this occurs. I can tell you that when I have talked to some young lesbian women, they have a certain sense to which they should act, quote, more hetero, end quote, because they're trying to assimilate. They want very much to fit in, and this has actually happened more with my age group than with some of the younger age groups. Okay. And then finally, another common element of oppression is what we refer to as tokenism. Basically, we limit access of members of the oppressed or the targeted group to the few who are assimilated into the advantaged culture. Okay? Tokenism is often used to describe what happens when we put a single person of color, for example, on an all-white board, or we put a single gay and lesbian person in an otherwise all heterosexual setting. We say that they have been tokenized. They are our token person of color, our token LGBT person. For each of these, it's important that you're familiar with the definitions of these. It is very likely that these terms and definitions could actually be a test question on the first exam for the semester. If you want to take a break and pause this is probably a good time to do it before we move on to characteristics of privileged groups. So now we're going to spend some time talking about characteristics of privileged groups. As we said earlier, one of the characteristics is that the dominant group gets to define what's normal, okay? And what ultimately happens is that when groups are part of the norm, they see themselves as being objective and neutral, okay? Anything that deviates from that basically is an agenda. You've heard the terms gay agenda, black agenda, the Muslim agenda. All these other groups that are not white, Christian, heterosexual, middle or upper class have an agenda. What that means is they're not part of the norm. They've got something they want. And the reality is that for most of us, what we want is access to resources. Okay. Another common characteristic of privileged groups is that they see themselves as being superior. One of the chief definitions of any sort of ism is a perception of superiority. Racism is all about believing that white people are superior to other groups. Sexism is typically the perception that men are superior to women. Okay, so moving on and continuing to talk about this, another characteristic of privileged groups is this concept of cultural and institutional power and domination. And again, we talked about this a few moments ago. Okay, Those in privilege have access to and control resources, goods, and rewards. Okay, what this does is it allows them to establish and maintain policies that limit these resources to other groups. Okay, what you see here is that they use it to exercise control over access to healthcare, housing, education, employment, political representation, and legal rights. Again, this is something that people in privilege do. And right now, one of the things about the Black Lives Matter movement is that it's challenging that control held by typically white male groups. So again, continuing on, another characteristic, privileged individuals, not just groups, but of privileged individuals, is a lack of consciousness about the privilege that we have. Okay? What this means is that people with privilege often have little awareness of their dominant identity. And the literature suggests that people who experience both privileged characteristics and oppressed characteristics are often more aware of their oppressed characteristics than they are of their privileged characteristics. Okay? This awareness is often used to continue to perpetuate oppression. Okay? The lack of consciousness also means that people with privilege are deprived of feedback from subordinate groups and don't learn about their behavior from others. And if you're experiencing some resistance to this, this is likely because people have never challenged you. You've never had a professor or a friend or a family member challenge you on your concept and your sense of having privilege. Okay. Characteristic of privileged individuals is often a sense of superiority and entitlement. Some of the literature actually talks about the fact that white people don't necessarily have a sense of being white, okay, but often they do have a sense of being a part of the norm and a member of the dominant group. They may expect to receive certain things, okay, and may question the qualifications of oppressed groups who are in position of authority over them. I know a lot of men who have resented basically being supervised by women. A lot of white people who have resented being supervised by people of color. Christians who have resented being supervised by non-Christians. Okay? And this is particularly true in Western cultures where we have this very strong belief that the superior should control the inferior. Okay, so again, continuing to move on, another characteristic of privileged individuals is that people with privilege often want to deny and avoid the oppression that they may have participated in. This is in part because when you acknowledge this, you have to acknowledge the discomfort that you experience. And for a lot of us, it's simply easier to remain silent when we're aware of injustice and not take action. Because it's easy to say, hey, I'm not impacted by this. This doesn't affect me, therefore I'm just going to keep my mouth shut. One of the definitions of allies is that an ally is a person who is a member of the privileged group and actually chooses to take action to help those that do not share their privilege. Okay, so continuing on here, we're going to move to talking briefly about the concept of intersectionality and multiple identities. Okay, intersectionality is defined as having a combination of identities, and frequently it's a combination of both privileged and oppressed identities. And this is a subset of the different kind of identities that people can have. We can have identity based on our ethnicity, our sexual identity, sexual orientation, age, class, ability, race, and religion. As you may recall in my introduction, I basically put up this slide and talked about the different identities that I had. But the key thing to note is that our multiple identities affect our experience of each identity and each ism. So my gender identity may be influenced by my class. Okay, how I identify as a female may be influenced by my class. Okay, my expression of my religion is likely influenced by my sex, by my gender identity, particularly if I were someone who attended a church that did not support full equality of women in the participation of the church. So each of these identities influences and affects our experience of other identities and also of the isms that we have. Okay, so this concept of intersectionality, that is, when we experience both privilege and oppression simultaneously, has several results. One of the results is that we may not feel privileged in one area because of our oppression in another area. Okay. An example of this is that many poor white people don't believe they're privileged as white people because they experience oppression because of their socioeconomic status. Okay. And as I said earlier, we tend to focus on areas in which we are oppressed and not those which we are privileged. Okay. Also, privileged identities may be mitigated or reduced by subordinate identities, such as class privilege may be reduced by racial oppression. So a person of color that is in our upper class, his or her class privilege may be reduced by his or her racial his or her racial oppression. Okay. Oppression experienced by subordinate identity may also be mitigated by privileged identity. So in my case, I am oppressed as a female and as a lesbian, and now perhaps as a person with a hearing loss, okay? But that sense of oppression, particularly as it relates to my hearing loss, may be reduced by my class privilege, because basically I've got the resources and the access to people to help me gain access to additional resources in terms of whatever I need to do for my hearing loss, okay? The key thing to note here, though, is that privilege in one area does not prevent subordination in another area. It may lessen its impact, but it doesn't prevent it. So the oppression that I experience as a lesbian is not negated by my white privilege. My white privilege may reduce that impact, but it doesn't completely eradicate it. Okay? And then you also see that subordination in one area does not reduce or eradicate privilege in another area. And these are, again, very important concepts that are going to be key for you to know as we move along this semester. So this is a chart, basically. It's taken from a textbook that you see the reference for, the footnote. And basically what it does is it shows us, on the one hand, the dominant identities, and on the other hand, the subordinated identities. And you can see the different categories here, okay? People of European descent, men, heterosexuals, gender-conforming individuals, upper-class people, temporarily able-bodied people, and that's really key, that word, temporarily able-bodied people. That word is actually used, that term is actually used because the disability literature says that everyone is temporarily able-bodied, okay? Young and middle adults are considered the dominant group. Christians are considered the dominant group. And then native born, as in born in the U.S., are considered the dominant group. And then on the other hand, you see the subordinate groups. So again, be aware of these and be familiar with what they are. Okay, we also have the matrix of oppression, which is very similar to what you saw on the previous slide, except it presents it slightly differently. So you see the social identity category, and then the privileged groups, the groups that are in the middle, the oppressed social groups, and then the ism that's associated with this. Okay. The bottom line is that privilege opens doors. Privilege gives us access to things that people with privilege do not have. An example of the privilege that I have is that I am in a position where I have access to getting a second opinion. If my insurance, which is very good, did not pay for it, I have the resources to pay for it out of pocket. But moreover, when I called UAMS and was told that it would take me until mid-November to get an appointment with the person that I wanted the second opinion with, I took the appointment they gave me and immediately called a friend of mine whose husband is a bigwig in the ENT program at UAMS and said, here's what's going on. I need your help to get in to see the person I want to see much earlier. The result is that I will be seen 2 months prior to when my original appointment was. This is an example of how my white middle-class privilege is going to open the door for me. So again, privilege opens the door for us, even if we don't believe that it does so. Okay. So if we think about what privilege is, privilege actually helps us get to the top of the building, to the balcony, much faster, okay? Because privilege puts us on the elevator instead of forcing us to take the stairs. And if we think about it, what is at the top of this building? What's up here? Okay. Well, what's up here is access to light, access to resources, frequently a pretty good view. Okay. If you think about buildings, okay, where are the higher priced condos and office suites in nicer buildings? They're at the top because they've got the great view. Okay. But which way is faster? Is it faster to take the elevator or is it faster to take the stairs? Okay? So think about that. It's faster actually to take the elevator. And what happens is that privilege puts us on the elevator. What's interesting though is that our combination of privilege and oppression sometimes switches from the elevator to the stairs. So I'm white, so I get on the elevator. But I'm a lesbian, so it pushes me on the stairs. I'm Christian, so it's back to the elevator. I'm a female, back to the stairs. Well, now I've got a hearing loss. I'm going to stay on the stairs for a while, okay? But so again, I want you to think about this. Privilege puts us on the elevator and gives us faster access. Oppression forces us to take the stairs. Okay. What happens when we take the stairs? We get worn out. There's a whole body of literature that talks about the health consequences of living in poverty, the health consequences of being oppressed. And basically, members of oppressed and minority groups tend to have poorer health outcomes, in part just because they're exhausted, particularly for low-income people of color. It is exhausting constantly taking the stairs, constantly fighting for what you need. Okay, the last slide in this is simply the references, and those are important. If you want to learn more about Suzanne Farr's text, you see the link by which you can download it, and then the other information from this presentation has come from these other two texts, and they are great resources. I know that this has been a long presentation. Hopefully you've kind of watched it in a variety of settings and taken breaks throughout it. I had no idea how long it would be, so actually in the future I will break these into much smaller presentations. But please give this some thought. As I said in my remarks earlier in the presentation, you will be tested on a lot of this. This is really important stuff, and if you're feeling a desire to kind of push back against this, I'm just going to say, please encourage yourself, do whatever it takes to open yourself up to this. This is really important stuff, and it's really important that you at least be open to thinking about this stuff so that you can utilize it and be open to it in your work with clients. So again, thanks for a great, I guess not really a conversation, but more of a monologue on my part. And I will look forward to continuing this conversation, dialogue, monologue, whatever you want to call it, in the weeks ahead.